Hi everybody, thanks for joining me for another episode of ATP, Ask the Pastor. Someone writes in today, "Hello Pastor, I've tried to follow the consensus of the early fathers in my doctrine and have come a long way since being a Reformed Southern Baptist. In my understanding, Christ commands total pacifism for all Christians, and I find this to be the teaching of the early church. However, this puts me outside the confessions, and I feel as though there's no church for me. Do you have any resources for convincing me that soldiers may use force, especially in regards to patristics? I've read Luther's that soldiers too can be saved, but didn't find it convincing. Thanks a lot. I enjoy your videos and hope to hear back." There is no clear-cut consensus on the matter of military service in the church fathers, in the early church. Now, many of the early church fathers were pacifist, but there were also many Christians who thought that military service was completely compatible with the Christian life. And so there was both the pacifist and the non-pacifist voice in the early church. Now, the pacifist voice was more articulate in the era prior to Constantine, but that doesn't mean that non-pacifism wasn't there. What we see is Tertullian of Carthage, Origen of Alexandria, and Lactantius are the three big ones who write the most severely against military service for Christians. And when we read these men, especially Tertullian, it's alluring to believe then that based on his writings that the early fathers were all pacifist. But what we end up seeing from this is actually the opposite, that it wasn't uncommon for Christians to be joining the military, especially in the last quarter of the 3rd century. So when Tertullian writes his foremost work against military service for Christians, which is called The Crown, he praises in that work a Christian soldier in the military for refusing to wear the laurel wreath at the ascension of the new emperor, and praises him then not only for not doing that then, but for accepting the adequate punishment for that. And so I think this is an example that there were in fact many Christians in the military who didn't agree with Tertullian and saw no problem with the issue of military service. Now, the fathers that were pacifist had two main reasons why Christians should not serve as soldiers in their opinions. The first was bloodshed. Most believed, as Tertullian did then, that a Christian shouldn't shed blood in any circumstances whatsoever. That was actually the minor reason. The main reason was the second one, which was idolatry. Now we see idolatry because the person who was the soldier in the Roman army was inextricably tied up with the pagan, social, and religious customs of Rome. And this is one of Tertullian's constant themes through The Crown and some of his other works, is that the baptismal vow and the vow to Caesar are mutually exclusive and are completely incompatible with one another. So Tertullian also taught then that about the scriptures, that the soldiers who came to John the Baptist, the centurion in Matthew chapter 8, and Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, that all of these weren't positive examples for Christians to follow. However, based on Tertullian's insistence upon this continually, it's clear that Christians in his time were viewing the soldiers in the scriptures, especially in the New Testament, as positive examples that Christians could serve in the military, because John the Baptist, Christ, and Paul never forbade military service to the soldiers that came to them in faith. Now, we also see then in Eusebius, in his ecclesiastical history, that the Diocletian persecution of the church began with the Christians in the military. So on the one hand, we have early fathers writing against military service, but on the other hand, we have evidence from these very same writers, their very writings, that large numbers of Christians were in the military with no pangs of conscience. So again, you had the pacifist and the non-pacifist voice in the early church. And again, the pacifist was the more articulate of the two, but there were proponents of Christians serving in the military long before Constantine became the emperor. Now, when Constantine does become emperor, then Christians had to face a brand new situation, which they never had experienced and which they never thought would come to pass. You know, with the ascension of Constantine to being emperor of the empire, at that point, then you have a Christian as the emperor, and a devout Christian at that. And this is a seismic shift for the church, that it had to struggle with the question of violence and military service in a completely new context. Now, if one believes that the church prior to Constantine was strictly pacifist, then this reevaluation of things looks like an about face, looks like a change of position. But if we admit that before Constantine, both the pacifist and the non-pacifist voice were present, then this isn't so much of a dramatic change. Rather, consider that before Constantine, Christians had little to no part in the governing of the state, in the administration of the state and maintaining peace. But now that Christianity was no longer an illicit religion, and the emperor himself was a devout Christian, they had to wrestle with how Christians should administer the state, part of which is bearing arms to protect the peace and maintain the peace. And Tertullian and others just hadn't dealt with those questions because that context didn't exist in their time, and frankly, they thought that that context would never come to pass. Now, because the emperor was a Christian then, the worship of the emperor and the pagan gods was no longer required in the military service. Although during the very brief reign of Julian the Apostate, paganism was revived even in the military. Now, with the expulsion of the required idolatry for military service, Tertullian's main reason for forbidding military service was gone. The other reason that the early fathers forbade military service, that is bloodshed, was also then no longer looked upon as being an absolute command. And so many of the fathers reasoned that soldiers, as servants of Caesar, who himself was God's minister to rule, that they could shed blood in service to Caesar for the sake of maintaining good order and peace. Ambrose of Milan and Augustine of Hippo are two that had the most to say about this, but there were others as well. Both Ambrose and Augustine argued that soldiers can shed blood not as private citizens, but within their office as soldier. Augustine's best treatment of this, in my opinion, is Book 22 of his reply to Faustus the Manichaean. And his argument there is essentially the argument that Luther picks up in his writing about this. Now, another aspect of both Ambrose and Augustine's writings on this is that they take the passages in the New Testament in which soldiers approach John, Jesus, and Paul, and they use them as positive examples for Christians. Both of them argue, much like the non-pacifists before Constantine, that Christ, John, and Paul never told Christians to abandon their vocation as soldier because it was intrinsically sinful or incompatible with the Christian faith. This is the way then that many Christians in the military had understood these examples before Constantine, and now you have these men, these fathers of the church, embracing that. So it's important to note, though, with this, that this is not, amongst the fathers, an endorsement of the military without reservation, or state power without reservation. No one granted the state absolute power to coerce or to wage war. In fact, this is where just war theory comes into play. Just war theory was developed as the middle ground between pacifism on the one hand and holy war on the other. And so all these fathers, Augustine and Ambrose, argued that under certain circumstances and with certain motivations and goals in mind, a Christian nation could wage war. Now, overall in this, I think it's just too simplistic to say that the church simply changed her position and did an about-face on this matter just because Constantine came to the throne. I don't see a reversal in the church's original pacifistic position. I see a continuity between the period before Constantine and after Constantine, because there were pacifist voices and non-pacifist voices before and after. What we see, rather, is the church applying the scriptures to a brand new situation so that they could faithfully confess the faith, but also faithfully administer the state and keep the peace. Now, this is a topic that's far from just being historical, though, because this is something that we need to consider in North America today. As North American culture becomes increasingly secularized and paganized, we find ourselves in a very similar situation to the early fathers. Service in the modern military demands the acceptance of certain pagan cultural norms, like homosexual marriage, the interchangeability between man and woman, and to a certain extent, religious syncretism. And while the military doesn't require its soldiers to burn incense to the president or the state, it does require acquiescence to these cultural norms, which are sinful. And now, since America isn't a Christian nation, with Christianity being the official religion, Christians in the military aren't protected from the mandated paganization within the military. So in our day, the question is, can Christians be soldiers? Yes. The real question is, should they be? And that's a different matter altogether. In my opinion, since the military demands acceptance to sinful lifestyles and syncretic religious ideas, I would say discourage the idea at this time, in order to be faithful to Christ. Thanks for the question. We'll catch you next time on Ask the Pastor.